So, MAGFest. How are you guys doing?
Fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing great. That was the first question of the Q&A. No, I wanted to have a laptop handy to pull up transcriptions of my stuff. If you guys had specific questions about songs I've talked about in my videos, but we're having tech problems. So, I may or may not have that at some point, but we can just start going without it if you guys have questions. Well, first of all, I'm 8-Bit Music Theory. I should introduce myself. Thank you. I analyze video game music on YouTube and make videos about it. And just to warm up, sorry in advance for my terrible voice. I lost my voice just screaming at the hit points last night for being so good. I was going hoarse. So I get a few different kinds of questions that get asked all the time in comments and after panels like this. So I thought I'd start by just saying a little bit about myself and my background. People always ask like where I went to school and stuff like that. So I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, up in Canada. And I went to school at the University of Manitoba and got a degree, a bachelor's degree in jazz studies for being a drum set major, like being a jazz drummer. That was my degree. And I always loved video games and loved music. And I would just transcribe video game music for fun, like from high school all the way through university. And, learned a lot about theory in school from my profs, very much from the jazz side of things. So a lot of my analysis takes that kind of approach, which can annoy the more classically minded viewers sometimes. But I just had like a bunch of transcriptions of video game music that I'd done, and being in theory classes in school, start to notice like, oh, they're talking about this. I've seen that before in like a Sonic tune or whatever. Is this it?
No promises.
Okay. And so started trying to merge my two loves and post the results on YouTube, and here we are. So. And then the other question I get asked all the time is, can you make a video about blank? So I just want to, cut you guys off at the knees and say, I don't know. But, okay, so those are the main two that I get asked all the time. So other than that, do you guys have any questions? Yes?
So, like you have a degree, Scott, and I also have a degree in theory, and watching your channel is one of the things that makes me really excited about theory again. And I was wondering, this is one question though, what do you do that gets you excited and interested in theory?
That's such a good question. I guess, like, in the process of making a video, I'll like transcribe a piece and then just stare at it for a long time. And one thing that gets me really hyped is like finding something that I've seen in another tune, or like recognizing a pattern. Sorry, this is a bad day to get no voice, but or like for this last video I did on ODST, the track Rain. I had like a whole script written, and I was just staring at my transcription when I realized like all of the chord voicings use fifths and seconds like all over the place, and it was just like, oh, that makes so I rewrote the whole script. And so yeah, moments like that, I guess. Yeah, if that answers it, the question. Yeah, sorry, you, Rit. Yeah, I definitely, like when I started the channel, I was very much looking for a channel that analyzed video game music the way that I do. And there wasn't much out there. So it was kind of like, well, if no one else is going to do it, I'll do it type of thing. But very quickly, I kind of realized that it's important to me to have like stuff in every video that I would find interesting as a viewer. Being someone who's like well-versed in theory and taken all the theory classes, but then also stuff that you would find interesting having zero theory education. Because I think a lot of theory that seems complicated isn't that complicated. Like, a lot of it is just knowing what terminology means, which isn't complicated, just requires a bunch of learning terminology. So trying to explain things in a way that makes sense to someone, even vaguely makes sense to someone who's not super into the music theory world, is definitely something that I try to do a lot of. And like also to have like, you know, 3 main takeaways from each video, sometimes more, sometimes less, but you know, try to think about like, okay, what about this song? What could you take away as like a really young composer who doesn't know much about anything? What could you take away as someone who's way more experienced, you know? I definitely think about that kind of thing a lot. So, because every piece of music has like an infinite number of lessons you could learn if you dive deep enough, I feel like. So it's harder to narrow down what those are usually than to try and find things. Yes, sir.
So I actually I ran the beginner music theory panel on Thursday, and I took a lot of inspiration from your kind of videos. I'm a big fan.
Well, thank you.
The one thing that I found very difficult was how do you find a piece that very succinctly demonstrates a particular concept? Because I'm looking for one, and it's like, well, every piece has meters, so how do you find one that's a strong enough meter that's very easily identifiable? So you just have like a bank in your head of like 1,000 video game tunes, and you just draw it.
I guess kind of. Yeah, it's definitely tougher in my experience too to think like, oh, I want a piece that really showcases this. That's way harder to find than looking at a piece and going, okay, what does this really showcase? Like, what's the meat of this tune? And then doing that with enough pieces of music, you get very amazing. Thank you. Give it up for Tech. One sec. Okay. I don't want any of you stealing my password. Okay, but another question while I'm trying to figure this out.
What the F is that? How do you kind of bridge that gap between theory and practice?
I mean, it's a lot of practice, to be honest. Like, ear training is huge, and a huge part of why, like, what makes theory applicable at all. Like, I think it's a pretty slow process for everyone, but I remember for me, being the first like chord progression that I was able to recognize just on the sound of it was the minor 4/1, if anyone's familiar with that. It's a very like distinct sound, and I think that's I wish I had a keyboard here so I could play it out, but yeah, it's a very, very distinct sound, and I remember, you know, like I've learned about it, I had learned about it before and played it on the piano or whatever, and then like listening to a song was just like, oh, is that minor 4/1 thing? And, you know, went to a piano and tried it, and it totally was. So I think a lot of, like, sitting down at a piano or guitar or whatever, and just, like, trying to play the things that you learn and focus on how it sounds and trying to memorize that sound, and then actively trying to, like, pick out in the music you listen to, like, oh, what is that? That sounds like a 3-chord. Is it a 3-chord? No, it wasn't. Okay. Oh, next time. Oh, it was a 3-chord. Whatever. But, yeah, it's definitely a process. Yeah, I know the most boring answer.
Question on the video production side of things, but you do topics from a single song from the game to an entire day to an entire series. Exactly how much of a jump in effort, or roughly how much of a jump in The series ones are huge undertakings.
Yeah, definitely. It's very much like if I want to get a video out, like if I'm running out of time and I need to get a video out, then I'll just like pick one song and analyze it. But then the whole series ones or the whole game ones are way more fun to do for me. So I try and find a balance where it doesn't take forever to finish a video. I will say I will trick myself a lot of times where if I'm doing like a video on a whole series or a whole game, something like Hollow Knight, where I ended up doing 3 videos on it, where I just like listened to the whole soundtrack, and every time I thought I was done, like, okay, I'll do a video on this thing, some new tune I would listen to would just like pull up some whole new idea that I was like, oh, I can't leave that out. So it ended up turning into this whole big thing. But where was I going with that? Oh yeah, sorry. So something like that, I'm very careful about like cutting out stuff where I'm like, if that's not absolutely necessary, I'll chuck it because I know I'm gonna have plenty to talk about otherwise. But then when I do talk about one tune where I say, like this last video I put out where I was like, I'm just gonna do a video on Rain. It's a great song, great piece of music. So I'll just focus on that one piece. And so I sat down and I was like, well, I'm just writing on one piece of music, so I'll just write down all my thoughts on it and turn it into a script. And then it ended up being my longest video that I've ever made. So sometimes it doesn't quite work that way. But as far as like research time, the fewer tunes I have to transcribe and analyze, it goes much quicker.
This is something I asked for an entire series one, not just for like 6 months, so I'll take a record check on it.
Yeah, sure.
See what happens.
Fair. Negative harmony is super interesting to me. I just want to say, I love the fact that Jacob Collier, like, maybe it's not a new idea technically because he kind of pulled it from a couple different places, but functionally, like, as far as the sphere of music theory knowledge, it's a new idea. And how often does a new music theory idea get put out into the world, right? Like, I think that's super cool. But I don't use it a lot because it's very, I think it's more of a conceptual exercise than like an analytical tool. But I have used it in experimenting with different kinds of harmonic stuff. I wish I had a keyboard here. I should have brought one. But so like just the idea of like 4 minor to 1 has the same pull as a 5/7 to 1. Like you can extrapolate a lot from that. And so in writing some music, I've used it as far as like, you know, if you think of like, well, I don't know how in the weeds we want to get here, but if you think of like resolving to a C major chord, using negative harmony, you could say that B and F resolving to C and E has the same resolution power as D and A flat resolving to E and G in a C chord, or C and G, or however you want to do it. But so then using that, I was thinking a lot a couple months ago about like how many different chords could you build using these kind of voice leading ideas to have different resolutions. So like instead of a G7 to C, you could have, you know, an F minor to C, obviously. You could have an A flat minor 6 to C because it has that B and F, so that resolves, and it has an A flat which resolves the way that a minor 4 would. So yeah, there's a bunch of different kinds of resolutions that I was trying to pull out of that idea, which I found extremely fun to play with. But as far as analyzing other like already written pieces of music, I don't know if it has much. I mean, the approach as far as looking at all the voice leading is super helpful. But as far as actually like negative harmony, I don't know if many people use that in their composition.
I just learned this term very recently. I also don't have a degree in music theory at all. But since you were able to like have this like grand like sense of music theory, do you have perfect pitch?
No. I don't have perfect pitch, and I've never met anyone who has perfect pitch, and everyone I've met who says they have perfect pitch doesn't have perfect pitch. So part of me doesn't believe it exists. I know it does exist, I'm sure. Like, I've heard that it exists anyway. But Yeah, I think people put a lot of emphasis on perfect pitch, where to the point where like, you know, people think that if you don't have it, it's a bad thing, and you know, like even people who do have perfect pitch apparently don't necessarily have great musical ability. Like you still have to train your ears and still have to figure out how things work. So, you know, if you are someone like a Jacob Collier and you know, you understand how music works really well and you have perfect pitch, like then that's a deadly combo. But it's like relative pitch is the other one. For those of you who don't know, perfect pitch is when you can just hear a note and know what it is immediately. So like I knock on and you know, oh, that's a D sharp 3 or whatever. And then relative pitch is kind of what we were talking about before, where you train your ears to say like, oh, I know how the major seventh over the root note sounds, and that's so ingrained in my ears that you can play that and I'll know exactly what you're playing. And so you might not necessarily know what key a song is in, but just by listening to it. But like at the point I'm at now, I can usually figure out a chord progression just from listening to a piece of music. Anyway. Any more questions? Yes, you.
What kind of hardware setup do you use while you're transcribing?
It only varies in very specific situations. So I use Sibelius as my notation software. I don't necessarily, it's the only one I know. I'm not like a Sibelius fanboy, but I bought it in school and just never tried anything else. And it gets the job done. And now there's like this is a tangent, but there's kind of a sunk cost thing where I'm like, I've spent so much time figuring out Sibelius and all the stupid shortcuts and the idiosyncrasies of the program that if I moved to like a vastly better program, I would be worse at it and it would feel worse to me. So I'm kind of stuck where I am. But anyway, so I'll usually pull up the song I'm transcribing on YouTube because they have a really good slowdown function, which I try not to use. I'm trying to better myself and use it less, but sometimes like if it's a really fast run or something, you just have to slow it down to check. But yeah, YouTube has a great like 0.75 speed, 0.5 speed, which is super helpful. Transcribe into Sibelius, and that's pretty much all I do. I don't use any other hardware or software except for NES Music. If you download Family Tracker, you can find the sound files for NES games online, put it into Family Tracker, and then just see exactly like what's happening, which is fun. And then there's a SNES equivalent called SPC JCOM, I think, where you can't see the notes. Like on the Family Tracker, you can see the notes typed out, like B to C to whatever. The SNES one, you can just mute all the channels. So sometimes I'll use that if I want to have a very like specific and accurate score of an NES tune. I'll pull it up, I'll find the sound file online, pull it up in this program, and then just transcribe like one channel at a time. And that's been really interesting. Sorry? So the NES one is called Family Tracker. That one's more popular and well-known, I think. And then the SNES one is called, I could be wrong, it's called SPC JCOM, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, those are helpful for old Nintendo music. But yeah, I mean, I know there's a lot of apps and stuff that, you know, slow down music, or even if you put tunes into a DAW, you can slow it down and, you know, EQ stuff so that stuff's easier to hear. I try to avoid that just because I think, like I want my ears to get better from where they are now, so I try and challenge myself with transcription still, but you know, no judgment for people who use that stuff, obviously. It's just a personal thing. Yeah. No, yeah, you got it. Video game or like everything? Okay, so video game, you got to give it up to Koji Kondo, the man. just for sheer number of like, amazing tunes. Yeah, and his approach is fascinating to me. And like Uematsu obviously is like one of the goats. But like personal favorites, I really like Toru Minagishi's work on Zelda stuff. I'm kind of a Zelda music fanboy. I have to stop myself from making as many Zelda videos as I want because I think I might get old, but yeah, and Soya Oka has some great tunes too. Big fan of like the Mario Kart SNES stuff. Yeah, I'm kind of blanking on a couple names right now, but basically everyone who worked on the Mario Kart 8 soundtrack, I'm a huge fan of too. I love that soundtrack. And then outside of video games, I'm a big Beatles nerd. So Lennon McCartney, I think, is the best composition duo, or best, composing team or whatever of the 20th century, which is a bold statement, I know. But big fan of them. Big fan of who else? Well, I'm a big fan of 70s prog rock too. So I've been listening to tons of Yes lately, and I'm just blown away by a lot of that stuff too. So that's my current list from what I can think of right now, at least. In the back.
So many composers do a large body of work and probably listen to a lot of Koji Kondo and stuff like that. Are there any sort of tells that if you haven't heard this song before, oh, this is Koji Kondo, or oh, this is from me?
Yeah, there's definitely stuff. Because composers have especially ones that have such a distinct style. You'll definitely pick up tropes that they like to use. I know, just off the top of my head, Yasunori Mitsuda, in the Chrono Trigger soundtrack and in other stuff that he's done, you hear this ba-da-ga-da, little chromatic fall down everywhere. It's so funny. It's such a tell. So, when it's a Koji Kondo or someone who's so influential, if you hear something that sounds like him, the reaction might be oh, that's such a Koji Kondo-esque thing to do. This composer must like Koji Kondo more than oh, maybe it's Koji Kondo, but because composers steal stuff like that all the time from people they admire. But yeah, definitely, that's definitely a fun part about analyzing music. Way in the back.
As far as introduction theory, interpretation of bass, do you think rhythm is often neglected?
Yes, it is. And from me too. It's just hard to talk about rhythm. You can describe oh, a 5-to-1 sounds resolved, or it sounds like there's tension, but then trying to describe what a groove is or what a beat is, it always comes down to you feel it. Yeah, right. So I think rhythm getting shafted is just a function of it being harder to talk about, but I think it is a really interesting avenue of exploration, especially talking about rhythmic tension and release. As a drummer, a drum major in school, that's something that drummers think about a lot, and jazz drummers and every kind of drummer really, but fills and different kinds of grooves and approaches to things, or it's you are always thinking about, okay, we're going into this next section, so how do I build up something and then release it? So the big bam on the crash cymbal, that crash cymbal is a release. But it's a release that does not fit into music theory terminology really, because you can't just say, oh, a crash cymbal is a release. But that's true, but it seems, I don't know, maybe it's just me where it sounds weird to just say that, because surely it's not always a release of tension, but practically when I'm playing drums, it is. So anyway, this is kind of a tangent, but.
Just kind of piggybacking on that, I think that one thing I found is that there's very little names for things in rhythm theory, where there's tons of names for
Yeah.
harmonic and harmonic theory.
Totally,
So,
totally.
I don't know if it's just underexplored or if just nobody who was a drummer went on to become a drummer.
There's that stereotype. Yeah, that's true. There's also, well, it might also be a function of, like, at least what I care about as far as rhythmic development is pretty recent. Like, if you're going before the 20th century, not that there's not cool rhythmic stuff, but it's a totally different conception of rhythm than we have now. Like, introducing groove into music as a concept was like a huge revolutionary thing. And so, you know, and that's why like classical ideas of development and you know, developing melodic ideas, you can look at like a funk tune and go, oh, there's no development of melodic ideas whatsoever. There's no like harmonic interest. It's just one chord the whole time. So this tune is boring, but then it's not because it's funky. So it's like this whole new element that doesn't really fit into like the established theoretical model. So that maybe has something to do with it too. But yeah, definitely not a lot of names for rhythmic ideas. Yeah.
And then if I just go and listen to the soundtrack by itself, it feels a little empty compared to listening to
Sure.
the soundtrack. Is there like a musical explanation for why that is, or is it just about the game?
Well, I've read a little bit about Koji Kondo's like interviews and stuff, and his approach is very game first. Like he's not writing music that you're supposed to just sit down and listen to. He's always like, you know, watching the game, footage of the game, and trying to match like, okay, what music would accentuate the action on screen at this point in time. That was his approach for all the, you know, Mario, Zelda, all the big games. So I think it's fair to say like, and he was also a sound designer. Like he did all the sound effects for all that stuff. So he had a much broader idea of like, okay, this music is going to be playing, and you're going to be actively doing something, and there's going to be all these sound effects going on. So maybe where if you were just arranging for an ensemble to play a concert, you would make it more busy or have more stuff going on or have more change over time or something. Like in the context of writing for a video game, it made way more sense to do it the way he did it. I mean, he's the master. I'm not trying to throw shade or anything, but I think that's totally fair if you're like, oh, it's not as interesting to listen to the song without playing the game, because that's not how it was written, you know? And film music is the same way a lot of the time, where it's serving the story. And so sometimes like you can just listen to a film score and it sounds great. And then sometimes it's like, you know, just a low note for a long time or something. And you're like, okay, well, I don't really get what's going on. I thought I saw questions over here. Yeah.
So for the videos that you have done so far, what is the one that you have the most fun building? What is the one that you have the most challenging?
That's a great question. Most fun was definitely this recent Link's Awakening video where I arranged for wind sextet. That was just a super fun project, and I got Bassoonify and Medlix and Soundle, who are all VGM cover YouTubers who are amazing, to record parts like bassoon and flute and oboe and clarinet and bass clarinet and recorder, and send them to me of an arrangement I did, and I got to stitch them together. And so that was just super fun. Like I'd never done anything like that before, and you know, came out way better than I thought it would. So that was awesome. And I also just loved the Link's Awakening remake, and that whole soundtrack. So getting to spend time just listening to the whole thing and doing research and transcribing it was super fun. For a challenging one, I'll have to think for a sec. I remember, this is like a year old now, but SpiderMan, for whatever reason, took me a long time to just rewrote the script a bunch of times and like couldn't really figure out the point of the video. Like, I would write a whole script and then read it and go like, I don't know why this exists. I don't know who this is for. So it took me a long time and a lot of listening to the soundtrack to think of like I knew there was something there that I wanted to talk about, but I couldn't figure it out for a long time. So I don't know why, but that one really stumped me for a bit. I redo a lot of them. It took me like maybe a year, maybe a little under, to not have just terrible editing and voiceover. So, like my first 20 videos, I'd probably redo. But maybe I'd redo my first video was analyzing all the overworld themes in Zelda tunes and what that said about the game in question, and that was like my first idea for the channel, and kind of is what inspired me to make it. And I think it's a good idea, but yeah, just like clearly watching it back, I can't watch it back. I can make it like 2 seconds in. Oh, no. So yeah, I'd probably redo that one.
What do you recommend for someone that wants to like improve like the knowledge of music theory? Most of us use your past.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
Like, what would you recommend to improve like one's knowledge of like music theory?
For me, transcription is like the king. So transcribing tunes you enjoy and want to, like if you're trying to write music, tunes that you want to have written, like stuff that sounds like the stuff that you want to make, transcribe it, a lot of it, and like think about, because looking at a transcription and asking yourself, like, why does this sound such and such a way? Like, what makes the sound so intense? You'll start to see things come out at you that may or may not answer that question. And then experimenting with those elements in different contexts. So like, for an example, like I have a buddy who's really into that, just kind of like transcribing music and then taking it apart and then trying to build a new tune out of his analyses, which is a great exercise. I've done it too. So like the Link to the Past Dark World theme is like you tear it down and it's like, okay, C minor to F major to A flat to B flat to C minor or whatever. So then you're like, oh, okay, well that's weird that there's an F major and an A flat right next to each other. Like there's an A natural in the F that kind of conflicts. But so then when you play around with that and you realize that that sounds cool, and then you listen to other tunes or transcribe other tunes, you start to see that kind of thing everywhere. And that's kind of how the process of like picking up information goes. Like a lot of music theory is just attaining a big bank of info of stuff like that. So yeah, a lot of listening, a lot of transcription, ear training. If you practice like remembering intervals or chord qualities, that kind of thing. But it's a very like gradual process, and like no one feels like they know music theory like totally, right? It's just like you're a little better than you were before forever. So that would be my, and then also like classes, and there are good books out there that can get you on the right path too. I'm not trying to say that that's not the right move, but. Yeah. Right. Yeah, well, it's a tough thing to start doing for sure, because it's a high barrier of entry. But there's you can make it easier on yourself just by setting your expectations low. So like when I started transcribing stuff, I would just transcribe the melody and like, oh, can I play the melody on piano or whatever? And that was great. And then you get better at that, and then it's like, so my process is like melody, then bass line, and then general chords, and then like the full thing. So like if I transcribe the melody to a tune and then the bass line to a tune, sometimes like if I just want to knock out a quick transcription, even still, that's all I'll do. And then I'll just say like, oh, okay, well if it's this bass note and this is the melody, the chord's probably this, like figure that out. Like if the melody's playing a C major arpeggio over a C bass, like, okay, well it's a C chord. So, and then there's a little trial and error involved in that, where you can say, oh, okay, well, just from these two elements, it seems like the chord's gonna be D minor. So you play D minor, listen back, play D minor. It's not D minor. Okay, well, we'll figure this out. But most, like 90% of the time, you can figure out what the chord will be just from the bass line and the melody. So if you're just getting into it, that's what I would recommend is with tunes you like, transcribe the melody and the bass line, And then if you're not too burnt out, and if that's not too much of a challenge, or do that for a few tunes, and then start thinking about, well, what is the chord here, And then also don't be afraid to make a bad transcription. Like I have plenty of transcriptions that are just wrong, and it's not. It's like going back to old transcriptions from early videos even, where I'll look through it and just like, why did I write it like that? Oh, that's not right. Like so. Yeah, it's a process.
So you brought up Paul McCartney earlier. I would like to ask where you fall on the giant bomb split of 1980s contemporary secretary of ironic appreciation or abject disgust.
I don't know the song, Temporary Secretary. I feel like a fraud. I'll have to check it out.
What's something for theory and music that you're finding particularly challenging or engaging now?
Mm,
You've got a handle on this transcribing and analyzing things.
sure.
Do that, but what are you finding
That's a good question too.
transcribing and analyzing still there?
Right. For sure. Well, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think there's like an infinite amount of knowledge you could pull out of any piece of music if you just work hard enough. Lately, I've been really into voicing stuff, which isn't necessarily like, it's not that I've never thought about that before, but just like the mechanics of it I'm finding really interesting now for whatever reason. And that's kind of like, I feel like I brought up Jacob Collier a lot, but his whole conception too is very like voicing oriented and treating every part of a piece of music like just a bunch of separate voices all moving in their own way, which is how he does like whatever, 100-part choral parts, so it makes sense that he thinks about it like that. But yeah, that kind of thing, because there's really subtle differences in how you voice chords that bring out these really specific qualities. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And then I've also been challenging, like I've been thinking about, I kind of talked about before, but groove and that kind of rhythmic idea. I've been thinking about how to talk about that in a way, like how to try and like figure out what that is in a way other than just being like, oh, listen, this is groovy, right? But that's still eluding me for sure, figuring that out. Or like how different grooves work, like, because there's so many different ways. This is something that I think is interesting, so I'm going off on a tangent, but I was never super into jazz music, like in high school. There was like 1 or 2 jazz albums that I liked, but I didn't consider myself a jazz musician. So going into jazz school, because it was the only degree I could get where I could play drums, and my parents were like, well, you have to get a degree. I was like, okay, I'm going to waste it on a jazz studies degree, so there you go. But over the course of a couple years of like, listening to this stuff all the time because I had to and trying to figure out how to play it and, learning about the history of it, like I totally fell in love with it. And music that didn't sound groovy at all to me in high school, all of a sudden was like, oh yeah, it's right, like so groovy. So I was thinking like, how is that possible that you can have a song be so groovy and like beloved by the whole jazz community as like a historic monumental album for its grooviness, and then the average person is like, or maybe just me in high school, it just goes way over my head. I don't understand at all. So there's definitely an element of like, I mean, I don't have the answer, so maybe this is a story that goes nowhere, but there's definitely an element of like what you expect to any piece of music. Like jazz is such a strong tradition of like how it's played because there's so much improvisation that people really have to stick to their role within the band. So like the bass player is going to play a totally improvised thing within the role of I'm a bass player, so it's probably going to be chord notes. It's probably going to be like outlining the chord changes, There's certain things that you kind of have to do, but then other things that you can totally do whatever you want on. And so knowing what those roles are and what to expect makes you really engage with the music in a different way. And I found that with other genres too, like metal I couldn't get into for a long time, or country or bluegrass. It was kind of like, this is hokey. but then like start listening to Chris Thiele and Go Rodeo and Punch Brothers, and now I'm like I can't get enough of that stuff. Like it's so engaging to me, and so yeah, it's funny. I find that really interesting, the process of like, or I feel like it happens a lot with metal music where death metal is way too heavy to listen to. It sounds like noise, but then you get into like Avenged Sevenfold or some like kind of heavy band, and then like a little heavier, and then a little heavier, and then like you just rabbit hole down until you're listening to just like, oh, and you're like, yeah, this is killing. And everyone else is like, what are you talking about? Anyways, I don't know where that was going, but.
So, one of my favorite soundtracks of all time, I've been listening to it for, God, like 2000, so many years. And just like a year or two ago, I realized that basically the entire soundtrack is composed of like 2 reduce, which just kind of blew me away because somehow I must have one of the and 2, when I sat down and like thought about it from a literary perspective, what do these motifs sort of signify, and what are they, what's the person trying to convey through this? I feel like it tells a completely different story, actually a stronger story than what's in the game itself.
Oh wow.
Is that something that you find happens a lot? Could we happen that intentionally? Is that something that there's a nice music theory way of talking about? Are we way today?
That's definitely.
Just not dive into all the details.
It's definitely something that gets used a lot in video games, is that kind of motivic, idea. I mean, usually not for like just for the whole soundtrack, but sure, right. But yeah, I don't know how to answer this. I think it's an established music theory or like film scoring idea to do that, to have like certain themes represent certain things, and then over the evolution of the story, like portray that musically. Like that's obviously been talked about a lot, but right. So that's really interesting. I don't know how common that is. Yeah, I don't know how common it is to have the music be like introduce a whole new layer that the rest of the narrative doesn't have. It's very cool, definitely. And maybe because video games are not just a storytelling medium, so I could definitely see a world where like a lot of the narrative gets lost in the course of developing a game, or not lost, but just like there are more important things to focus on as far as making it fun to play or making it feel good or whatever. But then the composer can still like access parts of the story that aren't there in the release anymore. I don't know. It's cool though. Super cool idea. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. I mean, I would love that. I think that's really cool. I think you'd probably have to have a game, like you would have to fit the tone of the game. So maybe you have like a very folky setting or something. Some reason where it makes sense to have the soundtrack be very like bluegrass oriented, and then you can have like every part of the game, like the slow stuff, the sad stuff, the happy stuff, the intense stuff, all these different types of music that you're gonna have all through this bluegrass lens. I think a lot of times where you have bluegrass music now, it'll be like Moo Moo Meadows and Mario Kart, and it's just like, oh yeah, we're here now. So it's more used as like a kind of almost generic, like, oh, this is a bluegrassy level, so we'll have bluegrassy music. But I mean, I would love to see a game where the soundtrack is all like that. That'd be awesome. Yeah. Oh. Oh. Mhm.
maybe on the more academic depth,
Right. I don't know if I've ever had an explicit like conversation where someone was like, "That's not real music, though, right?" I've definitely had like, because it's kind of awkward. Like, I do this for a living, this YouTube stuff. So I'll run into people from school and talk to old profs and stuff. And they're like, "Oh, what are you doing now?" I go, "Oh, well, try and explain it." And they're kind of like, "Okay, all right." Yeah. So I actually have a system where I have like my explanation for someone who doesn't know anything about this whole world. It's just very like, "Oh yeah, I make videos and post them online, and I make money off that." I had one guy ask what I did, and I said, "Oh, I make music theory videos." And he goes, "Oh, music theory? Like, what's that?" And I was like, "Oh, it's kind of like explaining how music works, like analyzing pieces, see how they work." And he was just like clearly was not into even like listening to music and just couldn't wrap his head around like what that even meant. So I had to just be like, never mind. But yeah, I start very broad, and then if they ask questions or sound like they would get it, I get more and more specific until I actually get to explain what I do. But in the back, yeah. Sure. So the majority of my revenue comes through Patreon, where people just pledge $1, $5 to every time I put out a video, which is amazing. I know a ton of creators who make a living that way, and I think it's brilliant. Like, it's a great system. Ad revenue has never been a huge part of my income, even like, you make more through ad revenue as your channel grows, but even now it's like, it's not, it's like a nice little treat when I get a check from AdSense. Like, oh, that's cool, but it's definitely not enough to stake my livelihood on. But, I'm probably not the right person to ask, because there's a lot of ideas out there of like, oh, if you want to be successful on YouTube, you need to have, excuse me, you need to have, constant, like a consistent release schedule. You need to do this and that. You need to, show your face on camera, and you need to, there's lots of stuff that I just don't do. And it worked out for me, but I don't know if that's like, if that's good advice or not. Like I don't take sponsorship stuff. I get emails all the time, but I just think like, I'm just like, yeah, exactly. I just like, when I watch YouTube, I like the stuff that I like, and I try and make my channel as much like the stuff that I like as possible. So I always get a little annoyed when it's like, oh, this video is sponsored by, and like I get it, no shade on anyone who's getting sponsored, like that's great. But just, that doesn't interest me that much. So yeah, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask as far as career advice, but Patreon is awesome, is my answer. We have 10 minutes left, or a little under 10 minutes left. Oh yes, you. Right. Yeah.
So, ostensibly, my question is, do you have any tips for your creative chords? And maybe the question is, can you carry that over to a
Yeah. So you're training chords, especially with really dense orchestrated stuff or really complicated stuff. A lot of it will come down to memorizing how a chord feels, which sounds really dumb, but it's kind of true. Like, and it's kind of like, it takes a long time, I think, to get a hang of, but you get to a certain point with enough ear training and transcription and stuff like that, where instead of hearing like, oh, that's a 3 chord, oh, that's a 6 chord, oh, okay, that's a 2, oh, that's a 5. You'll listen and just hear like the whole chunk and go, oh yeah, it's a 3, 6, 2, 5. Like you learn these bigger ideas, which, you know, if a tune's really out there and not using very conventional harmony or something, maybe it's just very, very hard to hear. But yeah, definitely like, I think it starts with that kind of like playing chord progressions that you like or that you've transcribed or that you noticed on piano or guitar in different ways. You know, experimenting with changing them a little bit and seeing how much you can change them before they sound different, but how much you can change them while they retain that kind of spirit of the progression or cadence or whatever it is. It's kind of a hard thing to, I think it's a lot of like self-driven exploration, so it's kind of hard to just like, oh, do this. But yeah, I would say don't feel bad about not being able to hear really hard stuff, because like I can't hear really hard stuff, you know? Like it takes a very, very exceptionally talented person to be able to like listen to a crazy piece of music and just know what's going on like immediately. So anyway, we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take a few more questions, but yeah.
Absolutely. I like watching your videos. Obviously, there's also people like Ricky Otto or Hartman. Is there any other YouTube people that you would recommend for someone that you do, maybe not video games, that music channel?
That's a good question. So there's, let me think here. There's, I mean, the theory, Adam Neely and 12-Tone and Sideways and I did a couple live streams a while ago now, like a year ago, I guess. So they're 12-Tone and Sideways are both like theory channels that focus more, like Sideways is more on movie music and kind of conceptual essay, video essay type ideas, and then 12-Tone is more like weekly, like let's talk about this song, or let's talk about this specific music theory concept, or the history of this specific thing. So it's a little more like technical, both great. Let me see, there's, I'm blanking on the name now, this is bad. I think Signals Music Studio is this channel, or it's a guitar player, and it's more about, you know, it's very like, I guess like rock guitar focused kind of stuff, but it's more like entry level, kind of beginner to even intermediate music theory stuff of like how do you produce and write this kind of song. But he's great, he's cool. He has a really good video on Master of Puppets from Metallica, how the like little, you know, is not really like in time. Like if you tried to figure it out, it's like a bar of 5/16 or something. Like it's really weird. So I you know, I enjoyed that one. He's got a good channel. There's another one that I'm thinking of that I'm blanking on too. This guy David Bennett Piano, I think is the channel name. He does like music theory stuff about a lot of like pop rock stuff, like the Beatles and Radiohead and stuff like that. And it's cool. It's a little bit more like it's not like very in the weeds with music theory stuff, but which is great. But I really like his stuff a lot too. So that's who I can think of right now. Sorry to everyone I forgot. Yes.
So I guess one thing I've listened to recently is a podcast called Strong Songs by Kurt Hamilton from the Copper, who looks at different forms of music theory of like very popular songs, which is sort of which I like listening to, and also talks a bit about grooves. So
Oh, cool.
yeah,
I'll check that out.
drums and all that.
Oh,
In
nice.
a very basic way.
Sure.
My actual question for you is, who are some recent writers or composers in or outside of the video games world that you find to do really interesting things with music theory?
That's a good question. Everyone knows Jacob Collier. He's like the music theory guy. I guess I shouldn't say everyone knows him. I'm sure people don't know him. But he's great. I'm a big fan of Dirty Loops, who started off doing covers of pop music and then went into original stuff. But like the reharm chops in that band are crazy. I love it. Let's see. I'm terrible at pulling up names, apparently. Yeah. I think we're out of time, so maybe I won't sit here thinking for another minute. But thank you guys so much for coming and asking such good questions. That was so fun.